This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a dialogue entitled Of Mewar and Mandan. The participants are Miss Rima Hooja, acclaimed historian, academician and writer, and Rajan Mahan, famous journalist and academician of Mewar and Mandan.
Namaskar and good evening. India, as you all know, is home to many majestic monuments, but few can compare favorably with the historic forts and palaces of the desert state of Rajasthan. Their powerful ruggedness, design, architecture, and of course the history of valor and bravery connected with many of them provides a captivating mix that attracts people not just from across the country, but from all over the world. Among the many former princely states in Rajasthan, the built heritage of Mewar has a special appeal. And among the major rulers of Mewar, the reign of Rana Kumbha in the 15th century is considered as a particularly significant period that saw the creation of a large number of memorable monuments. Besides Kumbha's own vision and patronage, much of the credit for the large number of wonderful monuments created in its era is given to Sutradhar Mandan, Kumbha's chief architect and a leading author and theorist of the time, and he worked in the court of Rana Kumbha in Chittor. But while Kumbha is of course very famous about his exploits as a warrior king and also for his patronage for art, literature, architecture, music, everything, not much really is known about Sutradhar Mandan. And to give us a perspective about Mandan's role and contribution, we have in this special session a very distinguished historian, Rima Hooja. Rima is not only the most eminent historian that we have today in Rajasthan, but she has authored a large number of books, has a PhD from Cambridge, and her luminous work on the history of Rajasthan, which takes us from ancient times all the way up to modern Rajasthan, is a classic which is rated by many as perhaps the most significant book on Rajasthan history after Todd's Annals. So welcome, Rima. Very happy to have you in this session.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and good evening to all our listeners.
So, Rima, as I was just mentioning, not much really is known. I mean, for specialists and experts like you, Mandan is a familiar figure, but not too many people are too well aware of all the role and contribution that Mandan made. So, before we kind of begin this discussion, would you like to give us an overview of the kind of work that he produced and what you think is the seminal contribution that he seems to have made?
Well, thank you for putting it that way, because you're absolutely right. Architects usually in the previous centuries used to be nameless, very much like sculptors are or painters. Or Mandan is better known to us because he also wrote some books on architecture. Now, I will come to the books later on. This in itself was a little unusual. I don't mean to say nobody wrote books, but very few did. Now, Mandan is living in a day and age where architecture is essentially forts, palaces, temples, more fortifications, and occasionally, beautiful stepwells or things like that. What he puts in his texts is also houses of common people. So this is one aspect of him. The other, of course, is that an architect now or earlier, you need to be working for someone. You might have your own practice in today's terms, but who do you build for? And Mandan was living in an age where one of the most eminent ruler who also built things, and I mean Maharana Kumbha of Mewar, and roughly this period of 1433 to 1464. And Kumbha himself, a poet, a musician, he was given titles by his own contemporaries. He was a great warrior, so he was also conquering areas. And in all of this, architecture, or rather forts that could be used to launch more attacks, were an essential part. So there is this kind of partnership that comes up. I don't think they meant it to be. It deliberately done that. But over time, I think Kumbha realized there was someone who understood what he wanted and he could translate it. And Mandan realized he had a patron who could give him the leeway to do what he wanted with stone and turn that stone into beautiful buildings or into exquisite sculpture.
So clearly, this is a collaboration between the patron, that is Rana Kumbha, and this wonderful architect, Mandan, about whom we don't know that much. So, how high would you rate this partnership, as a partnership in enriching the built heritage of Mewar and the whole of Rajasthan?
To an extent, I think it's a unique partnership. There have been architects, there have been rulers. We don't know much about the architect, or we may not know that much about the other architects of this period. Now, in Kumbha's period, we have a Ranakpur Chhatri, which temple will list some names. Chittorgarh will have a panel that names some. So we know much more about the architects. But more to the point, to Mandan's own family were all, now I'm using the word, and you're using the word architect, but they're really architect artisans. Right. They also make with their own hands. They make sculpture, they make the buildings, they make the plans. Not in terms of the blueprints of today, but they give that general idea. So his father, Chittor, was an architect artisan, a Sutradhar. His brother Nath was also an architect. Both his sons were architect artisans. One of them designed something later on, 2 generations post Kumbha's period, at Zawar, and that Ramabai temple still stands. But besides them, as I said, there are inscriptions which name a whole lot of other people. What sets Mandan apart is that even when he is not making a building, and let me give you a specific example here of the Victory Tower at Chittorgarh, which is a classic
That's not to his
example.
credit. That's
No,
some
it's
other
not.
architect, right?
It is Jeta who made it.
Yes.
But the sculpture on it could come straight out of any of the texts that Mandan wrote. So either they're practicing something that is common to all, which may well be the case, or eventually what Mandan sets down on paper becomes like the manual that everyone is using.
Follows.
And I think that is what makes him stand out. And I can't think of any other partnership in kind of pre-modern times, unless maybe we think of someone like Savai Jai Singh of Jaipur when he was building Jaipur. According to a lot of people, his architect, according to me, just his minister, Vidyasagar. Yeah. That seems to be the nearest we can get.
So fascinating. So clearly, Mandan had a background from within his family, of belonging to a family
Correct.
which was involved as architects or artisans in creation of a lot of fabulous monuments of medieval Rajasthan. But if you look at the specifics of Mandan's work, what would you rate as the top sort of achievement of Mandan as an architect? Would it be Kumbhalgarh Fort, for instance? I mean, you mentioned that Chittor, he didn't have much of a role in the creation of the Chittorgarh Fort or the Victory Tower, etc. So would you say that he played a critical and important role in the creation of Kumbhalgarh, which is clearly one of the most fascinating sort of forts that exist in Rajasthan in very good condition even today?
Exists in India, more or less, one
Yes.
would say, yes. So yes, it's the kind of urban legend, which is also historically true, is that Kumbha built 32 out of the 84 famous forts of Mewar, famous through time.
32 out of
32
84.
out of
It's
84.
almost like 45% or something,
Almost,
something
yes,
like
exactly.
that. Okay.
And Mandan had a role to play
Ji.
in many of them. I would say the majority of them. So that includes not just Kumbhalgarh, Achalgarh, Basantgarh, Kolan, Verat, Machan, Ahor, and Mandan is designing many of these. And when he's not designing them, he's setting down the norms for other people to use. So yes, definitely, Kumbhalgarh is the kind of the pinnacle of Mandan's achievements, because it is translating what he wanted to say in a classical fashion. And to an extent, they are building from the previous fort at Kumbhalgarh, dated back to easily 1500 years before that time. And it wasn't even a fort in today's terms. So there was almost virgin soil for them to build on. So it is a classical example of a fort, a medieval fort of Mewar. And that is, of course, Kumbhalgarh.
Right. And talking of Kumbhalgarh a little more, one recalls this great wall that has been erected in Kumbhalgarh. It's almost as huge in a certain sense like the Great Wall of China.
Yeah.
So give us the context of creating that wall. And secondly, why is it not half as popular, for instance, or half as well known as the Great Wall of China? And what can be done to sort of make it more famous,
Well,
make it more well known?
To take the second question first, I think that is true for so much of our heritage, our built heritage, archaeological sites which are under the ground. There is so much in India that we don't know enough about many of them. and we don't often talk to people about these sites, and that is one thing about Kumbhalgarh. So I don't know what we can do really to publicize it much more. But why is Kumbhalgarh so famous? Well, again, we have this architect who's told, make this impregnable fort. And the fort is impregnable practically. And Mandan used the natural geography. So he used the defenses that you have from the Aravalli hills.
Right.
So the outer wall is taking in a much larger area than the fort itself, and that is the first line of protection. So that's your classical example of a typical, Rajasthan fort of that period. And then within it, he finds areas which are easier to defend and puts walls there. And finally, what you have, the Katargar part, the uppermost part, is defended by smaller but strong walls and is the highest point of that particular peak. So again, in classical terms, your ruler's place should either be the center of a plain area so that it can be protected, or on the highest point. And here we see that happening. We see the lines of defense. We see that the approach is not straight. So you go up through various ramps and, you go through gateways which can be shut and protected. And now the same thing, I mentioned Chittorgarh and said he didn't design it, but his pattern is followed there. So when Mandan designs his portion of Chittor, which is an older fort, so the fort exists before Mandan, but the fort had an entrance from the eastern and the northeastern side. And Mandan turns it around, and the approach is the one used now. So I hope our listeners have a chance to go there soon or revisit it soon. We'll go through these 7 gates of Chittor. They're going through gates that were built by Kumbha, by his other architects, but conforming to what Mandan had decreed. So, you have a difficult access within the fort. Achalgarh, Basantgarh, Kumbhalgarh, to come back to it, all of these forts, what was recommended was that you had palaces, of course, but you had granaries to store grains.
Right.
You had places to store the weapons. You tried to put in the case of Kumbhalgarh, lots and lots and lots of water structures. So they could even farm inside.
Right.
In other places, if the space is less, then you have smaller water structures. Now, places to perform music. So he even Mandan talks of gardens. And he doesn't give us a description. Unfortunately, and we will, I hope, have enough time to talk about that also. But the text is not really speaking to us today. It's more like a manual for practitioners. So it's like using a little shorthand. But he says, good palace should have a garden attached to it. And they should be orchards, and they should be fragrant flowers. And they should be, and the term he uses is a Vedika, which is like a raised seat. And they should be water channels, lots of beautiful structures. Of course, they don't talk of grass. Grass is very much a modern British period onwards kind of aspect to our gardens. Now, if you were to hear the description or read the description, it's almost like he's talking about a Mughal period Char Bagh. He's not.
Okay.
And significantly, he is talking in 1450, 1460. The Mughals are not in India.
Right.
The Mongols have not come into Uzbekistan. They may have been in Uzbekistan, but not certainly into Kabul. So he's talking of an older tradition that we really do not know that much about today, because if you go to an old fort and you see a water channel, you will automatically say, "Acha, right, Char Bagh." It seems to me, hypothetically, that we are talking of a system that predates the Char Baghs, but is not quite the shape of the Char Bagh.
Right.
And that is what he uses. So we have all of this at Kumbhalgarh. We have temples at Kumbhalgarh, which again, they conform totally. You pick up something like the Devata-Murti-Prakarnam of Mandans, which, by the way, has both a Hindi and English translation. And you can see what he says about a certain form of Ganesh or a certain form of Vishnu. And you find those expressed in stone at Kumbhalgarh.
Through
So
the temples that they create.
Yes, and the sculpture that they... So it's almost like a textbook example. It's
Right.
like you wanted a student, something to teach students, a resource for students. Then you have your text and you
And
take
you
them to
take them there.
Kumbhalgarh and you
Right.
say, find the place.
Wow.
That's the beauty of it.
Wow. What a fascinating description, Rima. I remember at the beginning when we were speaking about Kumbhalgarh, you said that Kumbha wanted to create this impregnable fort. And indeed, in history, it turned out to be almost impregnable fort because from what I have read, it was breached just once.
Just
and even
once.
that, you were talking about the water structures that they've created at Kumbhalgarh. And apparently through the contamination of some water fort,
So-
was the only time, there was only once that they lost
Kumbhalgarh, and for a very brief time
yes.
too.
So would you like to speak a little bit about the kind of defense, I mean, the defense structure that is Kumbhalgarh, in
Right.
terms of what are the special features there which made it this impregnable fort that you were talking about?
Okay. Now, in common with all the forts, even the ones predating Kumbha and Mandan's period, forts are basically defensive. You know, if you think of them, you go into a fort, you can use it to govern from. But then you also have other palaces at kind of plain level. So our forts in Rajasthan are usually on some hilltop.
Right.
Where they are not, in the case of Marwar, if they're ground level, this wonderful fort of Nagaur, then you have to have it defended at a different level. But again, what you have, lots and lots of defensive walls. You have that at Kumbhalgarh.
Yeah, you have a somewhat similar structure in Mehrangarh, right?
Yes, yes.
I mean, one spot that I
Mehrangarh.
find very often somewhat similar to Kumbhalgarh would be
So
Mehrangarh.
Mehrangarh, which is the fort at Jodhpur,
Right.
or the Jaisalmer fort that people talk about, there in the middle of the desert, they're using all the rocky outcrops and then defending them. So what do you defend them with? Lots of high walls. You have gateways which are difficult to get through. You have roads that keep, or paths that turn so abruptly that you can put a gateway there and you can shut the gate and you defend that space from that. Most of our forts, Kumbhalgarh included, will have had all these little apertures. They're kind of ugly things to talk about in terms of what they do to humans, which is throw boiling oil at them, have pitch coming down at people, hot pitch, weapons, catapults, the lots. When the attacker is using catapults, and again, contaminating water is something that was done pre-Mandan time also. Usually there was one water structure. Contaminating it meant the fort had to, fall or
Yes.
or fight to the end or something. Here there are several water structures. That adds to it. But I think the greatest strength of Kumbhalgarh was the geographical location. So the patron and the builder select a place that is already defensible by nature.
Yeah, the
So
terrain
by the time you
itself
get
is-
through, the terrain
yes,
is such.
yes.
And when you get there and then you start going up to Kumbhalgarh, there are these, as I said, literally folds upon folds of defensive walls. You don't see them so much when you drive in because you're in a hurry to get to the place.
Right.
But if you were walking there, if you trek there, you'll know it before you actually reach there.
True. So, Rima, what's fascinating about this Rana Kumbha and Mandan partnership is that they not only created a lot of new wonderful monuments like Kumbhalgarh, but that they also renovated several older buildings. And among the renovative efforts that they put in, one that is talked about by many historians is the achievement that they had at Achalgarh,
Oh,
that
yes,
fort in
Achalgarh.
Mount Abu side.
Yes.
So would you agree with that assessment that that's probably one of their greatest renovative effort? And what would you say is the special one? Would you like to shed some light on
Achalgarh,
how they
right.
went about with that exercise and how significant you think that was?
All right. So Achalgarh, which is basically today's Mount Abu area,
That's right.
and people can visit it, was part of a different state when Kumbha became the ruler of Mewar. So it was part of Sirohi. And Kumbha attacks that area, takes it over, and therefore has to strengthen it, both against Malwa, which lies further to the south, but against others. So around 1540, 1552, thereabouts, he starts renovating Achalgarh. And he had already worked on Basantgarh. And again, this is on a peak, and it had originally been built some 400 years earlier.
Right.
So the defense then means, this is really vital if you think of it, so old-time Malwa, Madhya Pradesh, old-time Gujarat, still Gujarat, Sirohi, which is part of Rajasthan, Nagaur, which is Marwar part, Jalore, all of this kind of come together in this area. Mandan makes fortifications, gates, watchtowers, guard rooms, again puts in a granary because it's needed. He puts in an armory, palace, water reservoirs, temples. Again, the architectural layout, the proportion, the style, the plan, the way he wants buildings, it corresponds almost fully with the text that Mandan has left us. So again, it's like a total classic textbook example. Of course, the water reservoirs here are nearer the base of the fort and the palaces are further up. But again, this is part of what Mandan has been recommending anyway. So again, we find a classic example at Achalgarh and nearby Basantgarh, which is really difficult to get to now.
Right. So constantly you're referring to Mandan's books and volumes. So how do you rate him as an author? And would you like to shed some light on some of the most significant texts that he produced? Apparently, he's written almost a dozen books. So would you like to share
yes,
some thoughts
Rajan,
on
so
some of the major ones?
Actually, Rajan, how to judge him as an author is, we don't think of him as today's terms. Let me briefly tell you the names of the text he wrote.
Sure.
So the most famous, which students of architecture will use if they are doing conservation, is the Raj-Vallabh Mandan, shortened to just Raj-Vallabh. It's very interesting. You see, the term Mandan also means to embellish something. Mandana term is linked to it. And so this term Mandan is attached to many of his texts. So it's like a word play. You can see the author coming through here. So there is the Vastu Mandan, which is a text on Vastu. There is the Roop Mandan. There is the Prasad Mandan. And Prasad here are temples and not palaces, which is a word used, Prasad is also a word used for palaces in Sanskrit. Raj-Vallabh Mandan I did mention already. Then you have the Devata-Murti-Prakarnam, which is a particular favorite of mine, simply because I've had something to do with it. But then there are a couple I've not even laid my paws on. And that is the Vastusaar, the Vastushastra, and the Aap Tattva. Now, Aap is a word for water, and I suspect that one is on water. I would love to have a historian or somebody, give feedback and tell me what Aap Tattva was about. But so these are at least half a dozen of the texts that Mandan wrote. And we know that within 100 years of his time, his texts were being found in Kashi, in Banaras. And there is a South Indian Pandit who had copies of Mandan's text. So you wonder just what is going on. What is he as an author? He's putting something down. Why is he putting something down, Rajan? Why is he writing something at this point in time? Why is he, if he's just using the earlier texts or the earlier working tradition, that's the point. The earlier texts date back several hundred years prior to Mandan's time. And that may be the reason that Kumbha builds and builds and builds, and their temples and their palaces and their forts and their reservoirs. And maybe that is why he's got lots and lots of architects. He's got lots of building happening simultaneously across all of Mewar. He needs something which is going to be a common manual that the masons can follow. And so his chief, architect pens these away and starts sending off copies, or at least sharing that information with the master craftsmen who are going to be building.
Rima, we're now running a bit short on time, but one crucial question. When you look through all these texts, his theory of construction and architecture, do you get a sense that he was essentially just following the classical forms that were already in existence, or do you find that there were some special innovations that Mandan comes up with?
Yes and no to that. He's following what has already existed. He refers to them. He says, there are these old books, and he refers to some of them. He also says that his work, this particular work, Prasad Mandan, when it ends, he says, I've written something, but if you look at all the other works around it and you put them together, then it will be like a jewel gets embellished with other jewels around it. So he's conscious of what is around, but I am sure he makes changes, because what he puts down then is used in Mewar, in Rajasthan, and then we keep adding changes to it over time. So I think our architect artisans innovated, but within a framework, within a given framework, and given the patronage that, in his case, it was Kumbha, but somebody else, they were able to innovate just that little bit, which was permissible, and of course, leave us with these beautiful structures that we still have to see.
Right. While you were speaking, of course, I was reminded of what some friends have already told me, that you have been involved with coming up with the English translation of one of Mandan's books. Would you like to share with us which one is that? And what did you learn through that exercise, that translation that you've done? What did you learn about Mandan as a person and about his writing skills?
So the text is Devata-Murti-Prakarnam. As the text says, it is about statues to do with the gods, so it is iconography, unlike some of the others which are dealing with, architecture. 8 chapters. But what is interesting is he talks about the kind of stone you select, and the sound of the stone will tell you whether you make a god or a goddess, or you make the foundation of a structure with that stone. So that is interesting. He talks about proportions. And what I found fascinating is how do you check people from making something out of proportion? So he says something like, if you make a deity with the stomach too small, it'll lead to famine. So these are checks and balances. But reading it, you wonder, who does he actually follow? So when you read what he says at the end of a chapter on the Jain sculpture, you think maybe he's a Jain by his own persuasion. Then you read what he says for, say, Vishnu, for Shivji. Each chapter ends as if he's the absolute devotee.
Right.
And then he ends with the chapter on the goddess. And it looks like he is a devotee of them all. So what does it mean? I think it means this is what India stood for at that time. He did his work, which is his sculpture and his architecture, and he is giving an image of what is around him, but he is bowing down to the Almighty in whichever way he is visualizing that Almighty in his own mind.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Rima, overall, how would you rate the Rana Kumbha and Mandan collaboration as a special partnership among the multiple fine builders and architects that we had through medieval India?
Possibly, and perhaps the best known, at least for Rajasthan. There have been others in, say, southern India where the Chola rulers had architects, but there more emphasis was given to an architect. Right. In northern India, the architect and the sculptor chose often to be anonymous, sometimes have become anonymous because we don't read those languages anymore fluently. But I think this is a unique combination, and I'm so pleased we've had a chance to talk a little bit about these two here today.
Yes. Thanks so much, Rima, for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, your knowledge about Mandan and Rana Kumbha, because it's a facet of Rajasthan history which is not so well known. So we're very thankful and grateful to you for coming and shedding so much light on these wonderful sort of monuments and the creators behind those monuments. Thank you very much. I hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with so much of insight that you have, of course, as one of the most eminent historians of Rajasthan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
In our national program of talks tonight, you were listening to a dialogue entitled Of Mewar and Mandan. The participants were Miss Rima Hooja, acclaimed historian, academician and writer, and Rajan Mahan, famous journalist and academician. Concept was by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio, Delhi. And this program was produced and presented by Sunil Ganju of AIR Jaipur and brought to you by the Delhi station of All India Radio.